The courtroom was silent. The judge, the lawyers, the jury, everyone held their breath. A little boy stood in the middle of the room, his small hands trembling, his wide eyes staring at the tall man in front of him. "Say it again," the lawyer said, his voice steady but filled with shock. The boy swallowed hard, then took a deep breath. His tiny voice echoed through the large courtroom, shaking the hearts of everyone present. "I saw everything," he said, "and I know the truth." A murmur spread through the crowd. The judge adjusted her glasses. The opposing lawyer shifted uncomfortably. The man on the witness stand, who had been smiling just moments ago, suddenly looked pale. The boy turned to look at his mother, sitting nervously at the edge of her seat. His words had the power to change everything, to save his family, to uncover a terrible secret. The lawyer leaned closer. "Are you sure?" The little boy nodded. Then, with steady eyes and a bravery that no one expected, he spoke the words that would shake the entire courtroom. And then, everything changed. It all started 3 months earlier. Ben was only 9 years old, but he understood more than most kids his age. He had to. His family was in trouble. His mom, Lisa, worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table for him and his little sister, Emma. His dad, David, hadn't been around much lately. When he was, things were different. It started with whispers at night when Ben pretended to sleep. His parents would argue in hushed voices, thinking he couldn't hear. But he did. He always did. Then one day his dad left. He didn't say goodbye. He just disappeared. At first, things got better. The house was quieter, and Mom smiled more. But then something strange happened. A man started coming around. A man in a suit, with sharp eyes that never seemed to blink. He knocked on their door late at night. He followed Mom when she went to work. Ben saw him standing across the street sometimes, watching their house. Then, one afternoon, everything changed. Ben was playing outside with Emma when the black car pulled up. The man in the suit stepped out, along with 2 other men. They walked right up to Mom, who was sitting on the porch, sipping tea. "We need to talk," the man said, his voice cold. Ben grabbed Emma's hand and pulled her behind him. He didn't like this man. Mom stood up, her face pale. "Not in front of my children," she whispered. The man ignored her. He pulled out a folder and handed it to her. "Your husband made a deal," he said. "And now, you're going to pay for it." Mom's hands shook as she opened the folder. Ben saw her eyes widen in fear. "No," she gasped. "This isn't true." The man stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You have until the end of the month." Then he turned and walked away, his black shoes clicking against the pavement. The other men followed. Ben watched as the car drove off. He looked up at Mom, waiting for her to say something. But she didn't. She just stood there, staring at the papers in her hands, her face frozen in fear. That night, Ben couldn't sleep. He could hear his mom crying in her room. He wanted to help, but he didn't know how. The next morning, things got worse. The police knocked on their door. 2 officers stood outside, looking serious. Mom opened the door, her hands still shaking. "Lisa Thompson?" one of them asked. She nodded. "We need you to come with us," the officer said. "There's been a complaint filed against you." Mom's eyes widened. "What?" she gasped. "By who?" The officer didn't answer. "Please, ma'am, just come with us." Ben ran to his mother. "No," he cried, grabbing her arm. She didn't do anything. But the officers wouldn't listen. They took Mom away. Emma started crying. Ben just stood there, frozen. Something was very wrong. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew one thing. He had to find out the truth, and he had to save his family. But he had no idea what he was about to uncover. Ben held Emma's trembling hand as they watched the police car disappear down the street with their mother inside. His heart pounded in his chest. "She's coming back, right?" Emma whispered, her big blue eyes filled with tears. Ben didn't know how to answer. The world suddenly felt too big, too scary. He was just 9 years old. What could he do? Then he saw it. The black car. It was parked down the street, just sitting there, watching. Ben's stomach twisted. He knew that car. He knew that man. The man in the suit. The man who had threatened their mother just yesterday. Ben's fingers curled into fists. He wasn't old enough to understand everything, but he knew this. Whatever was happening to his family wasn't fair, and he wasn't going to let them win. But how? Ben was just a kid. No one would listen to him. Then an idea hit him. He turned to his little sister and wiped the tears from her cheeks. "Go inside, Em. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone." Emma sniffled. "But where are you going?" Ben took a deep breath. "I have to talk to someone." And with that, he ran. Ben's feet pounded against the pavement as he ran through town. He didn't stop until he reached the only place he could think of, the police station. He pushed through the doors, his small chest heaving. The lady at the front desk looked up, startled. "Hey there, buddy," she said gently. "Are you lost?" Ben shook his head. "No. My mom, Lisa Thompson, the police took her. But she didn't do anything. You have to help her." The lady's face softened. "Oh, sweetheart, I don't. I saw a man." Ben interrupted, his words spilling out in a rush. A man in a suit. He gave her papers, and then the next day, the police came. "It's not right. Please, you have to help us." The lady hesitated. "What kind of papers?" Ben frowned, trying to remember. He had only seen them for a second. "They had my dad's name on them." That made the lady pause. She glanced toward a door at the back of the station, then picked up the phone. A few minutes later, a tall police officer walked in. He knelt so he was eye level with Ben. "Hey kid, my name's Officer Daniels. Let's start from the beginning, okay? Tell me everything you know." Ben did. He told him about the strange man, the black car, and the papers that had made his mother so scared. He told him about how his dad had disappeared and how he had seen that man watching their house. When he was done, Officer Daniels' face was serious. "Can you describe this man?" he asked. Ben nodded. "He's tall. He always wears a suit. And he has weird eyes. Like, they don't blink a lot." Officer Daniels exchanged a look with another officer. "Stay right here. Okay, Ben? I need to check on something." Ben watched as the officers stepped into another room and closed the door behind them. Something was wrong. He could feel it. Minutes passed. Then, suddenly, the lights in the police station flickered. The front doors burst open, and the man in the suit walked in. Ben's heart stopped. Officer Daniels came rushing back just as the man stepped forward. "That's him," Ben cried, pointing. But instead of arresting him, Officer Daniels hesitated. "Mr. Callahan," he said cautiously, "what are you doing here?" Ben's stomach twisted. The police knew this man. Mr. Callahan smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I heard a little boy was making some wild accusations. I thought I'd come clear things up." He turned his sharp gaze on Ben. "You shouldn't tell stories, son." Ben's hands clenched into fists. "I'm not lying. You did something to my mom. And my dad." Mr. Callahan stepped forward, lowering his voice. "Your father made choices, Ben. Choices that put your family in danger." The room suddenly felt too small, too quiet. "What do you mean?" Ben whispered. Mr. Callahan leaned in. "You'll find out soon enough." Then he turned to Officer Daniels. "I believe this conversation is over." Daniels' jaw tightened, but after a long pause, he sighed. "Ben, I think it's best you go home now." Ben's heart dropped. No, this wasn't right. He was telling the truth, but no one believed him. He felt a hand on his shoulder. It was the lady from the front desk. "Come on, sweetheart. Let's get you home." Ben's whole body shook with frustration, but he knew arguing wouldn't help. Not now. As he was led toward the door, he looked back one last time. Mr. Callahan was watching him, and he was smiling. That was when Ben knew this was only the beginning. Ben sat on the front porch, his legs curled against his chest. The wind blew softly through the quiet neighborhood, but inside his heart, a storm was raging. Mr. Callahan. The police knew him. They trusted him, which meant that Mom wasn't just in trouble. She was in serious trouble. Ben clenched his fists. He had never felt so powerless before. No one believed him. Not Officer Daniels. Not the lady at the police station. Not anyone. But he knew the truth. And if no one was going to help him, he would have to help himself. He was only 9 years old. But he wasn't giving up. The next morning, Emma was still asleep when Ben left the house. He didn't tell her where he was going. She would try to stop him, but he had made up his mind. He needed answers, and there was only one place to find them. His dad's old office. It was a small building in town, right above a bakery. Ben had been there once when he was younger, back when his dad actually used to take him places. Now, the office was locked, abandoned. Ben stood outside the door, biting his lip. He had hoped it would be open. Now what? He turned to leave, and that's when he saw it. A light was on inside. Ben's heart skipped a beat. Someone was in there. He stepped closer, pressing his ear to the door. Voices. One of them was Mr. Callahan's. Ben's stomach clenched. Slowly, carefully, he crouched down and peeked through the keyhole. Inside, 2 men stood by a desk. One was Mr. Callahan. The other was a man Ben didn't recognize, tall, with a scar down his cheek. They were talking in low voices. "She doesn't know anything," Scarface said. She might, Mr. Callahan replied. And if that boy keeps asking questions, he might find something. Ben's breath caught. They were talking about him. He held his breath, listening harder. Scarface scoffed. He's just a kid. Callahan's voice turned cold. I don't like loose ends. Ben's hands shook. Loose ends? Were they talking about getting rid of him? He had to get out of here. Now. But as he turned to run, his shoes scraped against the floor. The sound was small, but in the silence, it was loud. Too loud. Instantly, the voices inside stopped. Then, footsteps, coming toward the door. Ben's heart pounded. If they caught him, he knew, this wouldn't end well. He had to hide. Fast. He spun around, searching. The hallway was empty. No closets. No exits. Nowhere to go. The door handle started to turn. Think, Ben. Think. And then, a janitor's cart. It was parked at the end of the hall, filled with cleaning supplies. Without thinking, Ben dove behind it just as the office door swung open. He pressed his hands over his mouth, his whole body frozen. Footsteps echoed through the hall. Getting closer. Ben squeezed his eyes shut. Please don't see me. A shadow fell over him. Ben held his breath. Then, the footsteps stopped. Silence. And then, a voice. He's gone. Ben's eyes shot open. They were leaving. Seconds later, the office door closed again. Ben let out a shaky breath. That was too close. But now he knew. Mr. Callahan wasn't just a bad guy. He was dangerous. And whatever his dad had done, whatever deal he had made, was big enough to put their whole family in danger. Ben had to find out the truth before it was too late. Back at home, Emma was waiting for him, her small face twisted with worry. Where were you? She demanded. Ben hesitated. He didn't want to scare her. But Emma wasn't dumb. She knew something was wrong. Ben sighed and sat down beside her. Emma, something bad is happening. To Mom. To us. Emma swallowed hard. Is it because of Dad? Ben looked at her. Yes. Her lip trembled. Is he coming back? Ben wished he could say yes. But the truth was, he didn't know. He put an arm around her. No matter what happens, I'm going to fix this, okay? I promise. Emma sniffled. But how? Ben didn't know yet. But one thing was clear. He was running out of time. And the next time Mr. Callahan came for them, Ben needed to be ready. Because he wasn't going to lose his family. Not without a fight. And that fight was only just beginning. Ben lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling. His mind raced, playing back everything he had heard in his dad's office. Mr. Callahan, the man with the scar, the loose ends. They were planning something. And whatever it was, it involved his mom. He had to act fast. He turned his head to check on Emma. She was curled up in bed, her little hands gripping her stuffed rabbit. She was safe for now. But for how long? Ben had a choice. Sit back and wait for things to get worse. Or fight back. He clenched his fists. No more waiting. He needed a plan. The next morning, Ben skipped school. He knew it was risky, but this was more important. He needed answers. And there was only one person who might have them. His dad's best friend. Charlie. Charlie owned an old auto shop at the edge of town. Ben remembered his dad taking him there a few times when he was younger. Back then, Charlie was always laughing, always joking. But now, Charlie wasn't laughing. When Ben walked into the shop, the place smelled like oil and metal. Charlie was working under a car, his grease-stained hands tightening a bolt. Ben cleared his throat. Charlie slid out from under the car and wiped his hands on a rag. Kid, his brows furrowed in surprise. What are you doing here? Ben took a deep breath. I need to know what my dad did. Charlie's face darkened. Ben stepped closer. Please. Mom's in trouble. And I think it's because of whatever Dad was involved in. Charlie hesitated. Then he sighed and pulled off his gloves. Come inside, kid. Charlie poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down across from Ben at a small table in the back of the shop. You gotta promise me something, Charlie said, stirring his coffee. If I tell you this, you don't go doing anything stupid. Ben didn't answer. Charlie sighed. Figures. He took a sip, then set the mug down with a thud. Your dad got mixed up with the wrong people. Ben's stomach twisted. Charlie ran a hand through his graying hair. See, a few years back, he started borrowing money. Big money. The kind that don't come from a bank. Ben's fingers dug into the table. Charlie shook his head. At first, he thought he could pay it back. But you know how it goes. The deeper you dig, the harder it is to climb out. Ben swallowed. Who did he borrow from? Charlie leaned back in his chair. Callahan. Ben's breath caught. Charlie gave him a look. I'm guessing you've already met him. Ben nodded. He's trying to hurt my mom. Charlie sighed. That's how Callahan works. Your dad promised him something in return for the money. When he couldn't deliver, he ran. Ben frowned. Promised him what? Charlie hesitated. Then, boom, the sound of shattering glass. Charlie lunged from his chair as a rock crashed through the window. Ben ducked as glass sprayed across the floor. His heart pounded. Someone was outside. Charlie grabbed a wrench and sprinted toward the door. Ben followed, his hands shaking. They burst into the lot. But whoever had thrown the rock was gone. Charlie cursed under his breath. He picked up the rock and unwrapped the paper tied around it. His face turned pale. Ben's stomach churned. What does it say? Charlie didn't answer. Ben snatched the paper from his hands. There were only 4 words. Stay out of it. Ben's blood ran cold. They knew he was asking questions. They were watching. Charlie grabbed his shoulders. Listen to me, kid. You gotta go home. Pretend you don't know anything. Do you hear me? Ben met his eyes. I can't. Charlie's grip tightened. Ben, my mom is in jail. My dad is gone. My sister is scared. I don't have a choice. Charlie exhaled sharply. Then he looked around, making sure no one was watching. Finally, he pulled something from his pocket. A key. Take this, he said, shoving it into Ben's hand. Ben frowned. What is it? Charlie lowered his voice. It's the key to your dad's locker at the storage facility on River Road. Ben's heart pounded. What's inside? Charlie shook his head. I don't know. But your dad told me once. If anything ever happened to him, that's where the truth would be. Ben stared at the key, his hands sweaty. His dad's secrets were inside that locker. And if he wanted to save his family, he had to find out what they were. But he had no idea what he was walking into. Ben gripped the key so tightly that the edges dug into his palm. The storage locker. His dad's secrets were inside. And if he wanted to save his mom, he had to find out what his father was hiding. But deep down, a small voice in his head whispered, what if you don't like what you find? He ignored it. There was no turning back now. The storage facility on River Road was old and rusty, surrounded by a tall chain-link fence. Ben stood outside the gate, his heart pounding. He had never broken into anything before. Then again, he had never needed to. He took a deep breath and pushed open the gate. It creaked loudly, echoing through the empty lot. Ben's sneakers crunched against the gravel as he walked down the long row of metal doors. The number on the key read number 117. Ben's breath hitched when he finally found it. A padlock hung from the handle. Ben's hands shook as he slid the key into the lock. Click. The lock popped open. Ben swallowed hard and pulled up the metal door. The storage unit was small and dusty, filled with boxes stacked against the walls. A single light bulb flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the floor. Ben stepped inside. He didn't know what he was looking for. He just knew it had to be here. He pulled open the first box. Old receipts. Random papers. Nothing important. The second box. Just clothes. Ben's frustration grew. His dad had told Charlie this place held the truth. But so far, all he had found was junk. Then, something caught his eye. A wooden box shoved into the corner, covered in dust. Ben rushed over and pulled it out. It was locked with a latch, but it wasn't locked tight. He pried it open and froze. Inside was a stack of papers. And on top of them, a gun. Ben's heart nearly stopped. He had never touched a gun before. Never even been this close to one. Carefully, he pushed it aside and grabbed the papers. His eyes widened as he skimmed through them. Bank statements. Secret accounts. A contract with Callahan's name on it. And then, a photo. Ben frowned as he picked it up. It was old and faded, showing his dad standing next to a man Ben had never seen before. But what chilled him was the writing on the back. If anything happens to me, give this to the police. Ben's breath caught. His dad knew something was going to happen. But why? And who was the man in the photo? Before Ben could think, he heard it. A car engine outside. His stomach dropped. He wasn't alone. He quickly shoved the papers into his backpack and scrambled toward the door. Peeking through the crack, he saw a black car parked just outside the gate. His blood turned to ice. Callahan. Ben's heart raced. He found me. The storage unit was too small to hide in. If Callahan was coming, Ben had to get out. Now, Ben darted to the back of the unit. There was a small air vent near the floor. It was just big enough for a kid to squeeze through. Without thinking, he pulled off the metal cover and wiggled inside. It was dark, tight. Dust filled his nose as he crawled forward, his heart hammering. Footsteps echoed outside. Then, The storage door slid open. Ben froze. From inside the vent, he could barely see through the slits in the metal. Black shoes. Callahan stepped inside, his tall figure blocking the light. He scanned the small space. Ben held his breath. Please don't see the vent. Seconds passed. Then Callahan sighed. Looks like we just missed him. Another voice, Scarface. Think he found anything? Callahan hesitated. Then he kicked over a box. Papers spilled onto the floor. Ben bit his lip. Doesn't matter, Callahan said. If he did, he won't live long enough to use it. Ben's stomach twisted. They were going to kill him. He had to get out of here. Callahan and Scarface turned and stepped out of the unit. The moment their footsteps disappeared, Ben started crawling faster. He didn't stop until he reached the end of the vent. Then, with one big push, he burst out into the alley behind the storage units. His hands were scraped. His knees ached. But he didn't care. He was alive. But he wasn't safe yet. Callahan would keep looking for him, which meant he had to move fast. Ben ran. He had what he needed. Proof. Now, he just had to find someone who would listen. Before Callahan found him first. And this time, he wouldn't get away. Ben's legs burned as he ran. His backpack bounced against his shoulders, the stolen papers rustling inside. His heart pounded so loudly in his ears that he could barely hear anything else. He had proof now. Proof that his father had been involved with Callahan. Proof that his mother had been framed. Proof that Callahan was dangerous. But there was one problem. Who would believe him? He couldn't go back to the police station. Officer Daniels had already ignored him once. Charlie? Maybe. But Callahan had just tracked him down at the storage unit. If Ben went straight to Charlie's shop, he might be leading Callahan right to him. No, he needed to think smarter. Then, suddenly, an idea hit him. Someone had to be willing to listen. Someone who wasn't afraid of Callahan. The news. Ben stopped running. The local news station. If he could get the proof to a reporter, maybe they could expose Callahan for what he was. Maybe, just maybe, someone would finally help. The news station was on the other side of town. It took Ben nearly an hour to get there, dodging alleyways, cutting through back streets, checking over his shoulder every few minutes. By the time he arrived, he was sweaty and out of breath. The glass doors of Channel 7 News towered above him. Ben swallowed hard. This was it. He adjusted his backpack, squared his shoulders, and pushed through the doors. The lobby was busy. People rushed past, carrying papers and cameras. Phones rang from every desk. A receptionist sat behind a large counter, typing on a computer. Ben walked up to her. She barely glanced at him. Can I help you? Ben licked his lips. I need to talk to a reporter. It's really important. The receptionist raised an eyebrow. Do you have an appointment? No, but... Then I'm sorry, kid, but reporters are busy people. Maybe you should tell your parents to call instead. Ben's stomach sank. She thought he was just some random kid. She wasn't going to take him seriously. No, you don't understand, he said desperately. He unzipped his backpack and pulled out the photo from the storage unit. Look, my dad left this. He said if anything happened to him, I should take it to the police, but the police won't listen. My mom is in jail, and this man, Callahan, he's dangerous. Please, you have to help me. The receptionist frowned and took the photo, flipping it over. She stared at the message on the back. For a moment, she didn't say anything. Then, she looked back at Ben. Her expression had changed. Wait here. She picked up the phone and dialed a number. Ben's hands trembled as she whispered into the receiver. Finally, she hung up. Follow me, she said. Ben's heart leapt. Maybe, just maybe, this was finally going to work. The receptionist led him through a long hallway, past glass offices filled with reporters typing on keyboards and answering phones. Finally, she stopped in front of an office door. The name on the glass read, Laura Reynolds, investigative journalist. The receptionist knocked. A woman's voice called from inside. Come in. The receptionist opened the door and gestured for Ben to step inside. Ben's stomach twisted with nerves, but he forced himself to move. Inside, a woman sat at a desk, flipping through a stack of notes. She was in her mid-30s, with sharp green eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. When she saw Ben, she raised an eyebrow. So, you're the kid with the story? Ben nodded, gripping his backpack strap. I have proof, he said, his voice firm. Laura gestured to the chair across from her. Sit down, kid. Start from the beginning. For the next 15 minutes, Ben told her everything. About his father's disappearance. About the strange man in the suit. About his mother's arrest. about the storage unit, and, finally, about the papers and the contract with Callahan's name on it. Laura listened intently, occasionally jotting notes down. When Ben finished, she sat back in her chair, tapping a pen against the desk. This is a lot, she admitted. Callahan is powerful, and if your dad really was involved with him, then… She hesitated. Ben leaned forward. Then what? Laura sighed. Then your dad knew what he was getting into. Ben's stomach twisted. But he didn't mean to hurt anyone. Laura studied him. Then, she reached for the papers in Ben's backpack and flipped through them. The more she read, the more her expression changed. She stiffened. Then, suddenly, she stood up. I need to make some calls, she said. Wait here. Ben's heart pounded. He watched as Laura grabbed her phone and stepped out of the office. This was it. This was his chance. Maybe, just maybe, this nightmare was finally coming to an end. Then, the door slammed open. Ben jumped. Two men in suits stormed into the office. Callahan's men. Ben's blood ran cold. One of them, Scarface, locked the door behind them. The other man, taller and broader, cracked his knuckles. Ben's breath caught in his throat. The taller man stepped forward, his shadow looming over Ben. Time's up, kid, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Ben's stomach dropped. They found him. And this time, he had no way out. Ben's breath caught in his throat. Scarface smirked as he leaned against the door, arms crossed. The taller man, broad and muscular, took another step forward. Ben's chair scraped against the floor as he instinctively pushed back, heart hammering in his chest. The big man cracked his knuckles. You've been sticking your nose where it doesn't belong, kid. Scarface chuckled. And now, we have to clean up the mess. Ben swallowed hard. This was bad. Really, really bad. He was trapped. Laura had stepped out to make calls. No one else knew he was in here. And these men, they weren't here to talk. Think, Ben. Think. His eyes darted around the office. A desk. A computer. A filing cabinet. A window. The window. His pulse spiked. It was small, but maybe. Suddenly, the tall man lunged. Ben dove out of his chair, just as the man's hand snatched air where his arm had been. The chair crashed onto the floor. Ben hit the ground, scrambled to his feet, and bolted for the window. Scarface cursed. Get him! Ben jumped onto the desk, his hands gripping the window frame. He shoved it open. But before he could climb out, a strong hand grabbed his ankle. Ben yelped as he was yanked back. His fingers slipped from the frame, his body slamming against the desk. Pain exploded through his ribs. Scarface grinned, tightening his grip on Ben's leg. You really think you can run from us, kid? Ben kicked. Hard. His shoe smashed into Scarface's nose. Ah! Scarface howled, stumbling back, blood spurting from his nose. Ben didn't hesitate. He twisted and jumped. For a split second, he was weightless. Then, crash. He hit the ground hard, landing on his side in the alley behind the news building. Pain shot through his shoulder, but he forced himself up. Above him, Scarface and the tall man leaned out of the window, their faces twisted with rage. Get back here, you little… Ben didn't wait to hear the rest. He ran. Ben sprinted through the alley, dodging garbage bins, his backpack bouncing on his shoulders. He could hear them behind him, shouting, chasing him. If they caught him, he didn't want to think about that. His lungs burned as he pushed forward, rounding a corner, and smacked straight into someone. Ben stumbled back, dazed. Strong hands caught his arms before he could fall. What the… Ben. Ben froze. He looked up. Officer Daniels. For the first time, Ben felt relief rush through him. Daniels' brow furrowed. What are you? Help. Ben gasped. They're after me. Daniels' eyes flicked up, just as Scarface and the tall man rounded the corner. Scarface, still bleeding from his nose, stopped cold. The tall man cursed under his breath. Daniels' expression darkened. He immediately stepped in front of Ben, one hand reaching for his gun. You too, he said, his voice deadly calm. Hands where I can see them. Scarface hesitated. Then, without a word, he and the tall man turned and ran. Daniels took a step forward, but Ben grabbed his arm. No, he gasped. Forget them. You have to listen to me. Daniels frowned. Ben, what's going on? Ben yanked his backpack open and shoved the papers at him. Daniels took them, flipping through the pages, and froze. His face went pale. Slowly, he looked back at Ben. Where did you get these? Ben's chest heaved. My dad's storage locker. Callahan framed my mom. He's been after me ever since I found these. Daniel's grip on the papers tightened. Then, without another word, he grabbed his radio. "This is Officer Daniels," he said, his voice firm. "I need immediate backup at Channel 7 News. And give me a warrant for the arrest of Richard Callahan." Ben's heart stopped. Was this really happening? Was someone finally believing him? Daniels turned back to him. "You're coming with me," he said. "We're getting your mom out of jail." Ben's breath caught. Mom. After everything. She was finally going to be free. But just as they turned to leave, bang! A gunshot split the air. Daniels shoved Ben to the ground. Ben's ears rang. People screamed. And as he looked up, he saw a black car speeding toward them. Callahan. And this time, he wasn't playing games. The black car roared toward them, tires screeching against the pavement. Ben's heart slammed against his ribs. Callahan wasn't trying to scare him anymore. He was trying to end this. "Move." Officer Daniels grabbed Ben's arm and yanked him toward cover. Another gunshot rang out. The bullet whizzed past them, shattering a nearby car window. People screamed, running for cover. Daniels pulled his gun and aimed, but before he could fire, the black car swerved hard and sped away. Ben's breath came in short, sharp gasps. They were trying to kill him. Right there, in the middle of the street. This wasn't just a game anymore. Callahan was done waiting. And if Ben didn't end this soon, he wouldn't get another chance. Minutes later, backup arrived. A fleet of police cars surrounded the area, officers swarming the scene. Ben sat on the back of an ambulance, his hands still shaking. Daniels was talking to another officer. Ben tried to focus, but everything felt blurry, like he was outside of his own body. His mind kept replaying the gunshot. The black car rushing toward him. Callahan wasn't just dangerous. He was unstoppable. Daniels walked over and knelt beside him. "You okay, kid?" Ben swallowed hard. "They almost." His voice broke. Daniels put a firm hand on his shoulder. "They didn't." Ben blinked. The officer's voice was steady, strong. "You're safe, Ben. And thanks to you, we have enough evidence to bring Callahan in." Ben's chest tightened. It wasn't over yet. "Can we get my mom out?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Daniels gave him a small nod. "We're working on it. I just sent the papers to the district attorney. If everything checks out, she'll be released soon." Relief washed over Ben. Mom. She was finally coming home. But deep inside, something still didn't feel right. Callahan was still out there. And if Ben had learned anything, it was that Callahan wasn't the type to run. Which meant he had a plan. 3 hours later, Ben stood outside the county jail, his stomach in knots. A line of officers waited near the entrance. Daniel stood beside him, arms crossed. And then, the door opened. Ben's breath caught. Mom stepped out. Her face was tired, her clothes wrinkled. But the moment she saw Ben, her eyes filled with tears. Ben. He barely had time to react before she scooped him up, holding him so tight, he thought he might stop breathing. Ben's eyes burned as he buried his face into her shoulder. "I knew you'd come for me," she whispered, her voice shaking. Ben's throat tightened. He had never been so scared, so exhausted, so relieved. He squeezed her tighter. "I had to." Behind them, Daniels cleared his throat. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, "I'm sorry for what you went through, but I need you both to know this isn't over yet." Mom tensed. "Callahan." Daniels nodded. "We have enough to arrest him, but we need to find him first." Ben's stomach churned. Callahan wasn't going to wait to be arrested. He was going to strike first. And Ben had a terrible feeling that he knew exactly where Callahan would go. "Home. Emma." Ben's body went rigid. "Emma," he gasped. Mom's face drained of color. They had left her alone. And if Callahan wanted to hurt them, that's exactly where he would go first. Ben spun on his heels and ran. He wasn't going to let Callahan win. Not now. Not ever. Ben ran like his life depended on it. Because right now, Emma's life did. His feet pounded against the pavement, his lungs burning as he sprinted through the streets. Mom and Officer Daniels were right behind him, their voices calling out, but Ben didn't stop. The only thing in his head was Emma. She was alone, and Callahan was coming. The house was still blocks away. But suddenly, a scream. A small, terrified scream. Ben's blood ran cold. Emma. He pushed himself harder, his legs aching as he turned the corner onto their street. And froze. The black car was in their driveway. The front door was open. And inside the house, Ben saw him. Callahan. He was holding Emma by the wrist. She was crying, trying to pull away. Ben's whole world tilted. Before he could think, before he could even breathe, he charged forward. Let her go, he screamed. Callahan's head snapped up. For a split second, their eyes locked. Then, Callahan yanked Emma closer, pulling something from his coat. A gun. Ben skidded to a stop. Everything froze. Emma sobbed, struggling in Callahan's grip. Callahan's face was calm, his sharp eyes flicking to Ben. You just don't know when to quit, do you, kid? Ben's whole body shook. Let her go. Callahan smirked. Or what? Behind Ben, Mom and Officer Daniels arrived. Daniels immediately raised his gun. Drop it, Callahan. For the first time, Callahan looked surprised. His grip on Emma tightened. Then, he smiled. Ben's skin crawled. You think you've won, huh? Callahan said. You think those papers will bring me down? Daniel's gun didn't waver. This is over. Let the girl go. Callahan tilted his head. Then, without warning, he shoved Emma away. She stumbled, falling to the floor. And Callahan bolted. Straight toward the back door. Daniels fired. Bang. The bullet missed, hitting the door frame as Callahan vanished into the backyard. Daniels cursed and took off after him. But Ben didn't care. All he cared about was Emma. She was sobbing, curled up on the floor. Ben ran to her, dropping to his knees. Emma, are you okay? She threw herself into his arms, shaking. I was so scared, she cried. Ben held her tight. I know, but it's over now. You're safe. Mom dropped down beside them, pulling them both into a hug. Tears streamed down her face. It's over, she whispered. It's finally over. But even as Ben held them close, he knew she was wrong. Because outside, Callahan was still running. And Ben knew one thing for sure. Until Callahan was caught, his family would never be safe. Ben held Emma tightly, her small body trembling in his arms. Mom's grip on them was just as tight, as if she was afraid they might disappear. But Ben couldn't relax. Not yet. Not while Callahan was still out there. Officer Daniels had chased him out the back door, but Ben knew Callahan wasn't the type to run forever. He was a snake, and snakes always came back to bite. The sound of sirens filled the air as more police cars rushed down the street. Mom finally pulled back, cupping Ben's face. Are you hurt? Ben shook his head quickly, but his eyes flicked to Emma. She grabbed me. Emma sniffled. She said he was going to take me away. Ben's stomach twisted. Callahan had been planning to kidnap her. What if they had been too late? Ben clenched his fists. No, he wasn't going to think about that. They had stopped him. For now. But deep inside, he knew. This wasn't over yet. The house was swarming with officers now. Mom held Emma on the couch while Ben sat beside them, his legs still shaking. Officer Daniels came in through the back door, looking frustrated. He's gone, he said, rubbing a hand over his jaw. But not for long. We've got officers searching the whole area. Mom's lips pressed together. What if he won't get far? Daniel's voice was firm. We have enough to put out an arrest warrant. His power won't protect him this time. Ben wasn't so sure. Callahan had connections. Money. He wouldn't just sit and wait to get caught. But for the first time, they had the upper hand. And Ben wasn't going to waste it. Later that night, Ben sat on the floor in his room, staring at the papers. The evidence he had taken from the storage unit. Daniels had made copies of everything, sending them to the district attorney. But there was one thing Ben had held on to. The photo. The one of his dad, standing next to the mystery man. Ben flipped it over, reading the words again. If anything happens to me, give this to the police. Ben's stomach clenched. His dad had known he was in danger. And that man in the photo, who was he? Ben needed to know. Because deep down, he had a feeling. This man was the key to everything. The next morning, Ben woke up to news. Mom had been on the phone with Daniels all morning, her voice hushed. When she hung up, she looked at Ben. They found him. Ben's breath hitched. Callahan. Where? He asked. Mom's lips pressed into a tight line. An abandoned warehouse outside of town. The police are surrounding the place now. Ben's chest tightened. This was it. Callahan was finally going to pay. But something felt off. Like this was too easy. Ben looked down at the photo in his hands. The words on the back echoed in his mind. What if there was something more? Something they weren't seeing? Before he could think too much, Mom placed a hand on his shoulder. Daniels wants us to stay put until they bring him in. Ben nodded slowly. But his gut told him. This wasn't over yet. And he was right. Because an hour later, the police lost Callahan. And that's when everything got worse. Ben felt like the ground had been ripped from under him. Callahan was gone. The police had surrounded the warehouse. They had been so close to catching him. But somehow, He had slipped through their fingers. Now he was out there. And Ben knew one thing for sure. Callahan wasn't going to run. He was going to strike back. Mom's face was pale as she hung up the phone. Daniel said they're still searching. He doesn't think Callahan will get far. Ben clenched his fists. He will. Callahan was too smart to sit still and wait. He was already planning something. And if Ben didn't figure out what, someone else was going to get hurt. That night, Ben sat at the kitchen table, staring at the photo. His dad, standing next to the mystery man. Something about it bothered him. He had stared at it 100 times now, but he still didn't know why his dad had thought this was important. The message on the back was clear. If anything happens to me, give this to the police. But why? What did this man have to do with any of it? Ben grabbed his phone and took a picture of the photo. Then, he searched online. At first, nothing came up. Just a bunch of random names and old business articles. But then, he found something. A news article. From 5 years ago. Ben's stomach twisted as he read the headline. Local business owner found dead after mysterious disappearance. Ben's hands went cold. He clicked the article, and his breath hitched. Because the photo of the man in the article was the same man in the picture with his dad. And suddenly, it all made sense. Ben ran to find Mom. She was sitting on the couch, holding Emma close. The news was playing softly in the background. Mom. Ben's voice was urgent. She sat up straight. What is it? Ben shoved his phone toward her. Look at this. Mom took the phone, frowning. She read the article, and her face drained of color. She slowly looked at Ben. Where did you find this? Ben grabbed the photo from the table. Dad had it in the storage unit. Mom's hands shook as she stared at the photo. Ben's voice was quiet. Who is he? Mom swallowed hard. Then, she whispered his name. James Holloway. Ben's heart pounded. Mom closed her eyes, like she was forcing herself to remember. Holloway owned a small finance company, she said. Your dad? He used to work for him before we started having money problems. Ben listened carefully. Mom's voice shook as she continued. Then one day, Holloway disappeared. The police never found him. A month later, his body was discovered in a river outside of town. Ben's stomach dropped. Callahan. His voice was barely a whisper. Mom nodded. Ben could barely breathe. His dad had been working for Holloway. Then, Holloway disappeared. Had Dad known something? Is that why Callahan had come after him? Is that why Dad had run? Ben's mind raced. But before he could think any further, the power went out. Everything plunged into darkness. Ben's heart stopped. Emma screamed. Then, a voice from outside. Cold. Calm. Come out, Ben. Ben's stomach flipped. Callahan. He was here. And this time, he wasn't leaving without a fight. The house was dead silent. Ben's breath came in short, sharp gasps as the darkness pressed in around them. Outside, the wind howled through the trees. And then, the voice came again. Calm. Cold. Closer. Come out, Ben. We both know this ends tonight. Ben's stomach twisted into knots. Callahan wasn't just threatening them anymore. He was here. He was inside the house. Emma whimpered, clutching Mom's arm. Be Benny. I'm scared. Ben swallowed hard and grabbed her hand. It's gonna be okay, he whispered, even though he wasn't sure it was true. Mom pulled them both close. Her voice was low and urgent. We have to get out. Quietly. Ben nodded. The back door. If they could just make it outside, they could run. Daniels and the police were still out there, searching for Callahan. They just had to stay ahead of him long enough to reach help. But then, a floorboard creaked. From the hallway. Footsteps. Ben's blood ran cold. Callahan was inside the house. Coming closer. Ben acted fast. He grabbed Emma's hand, nodding toward the kitchen. Mom understood immediately. They moved. Silently. Carefully. Every step felt like an eternity. The door was right there. Just a few more feet. Then, a shadow moved. Ben's heart stopped. A tall figure stepped into the doorway. And for the first time, Ben came face to face with Callahan. The man was calm. Too calm. Even in the darkness, Ben could see the cold amusement in his eyes. Like he had already won. There you are, Callahan said smoothly. He tilted his head. You gave me quite a chase, kid. Mom stepped in front of Ben and Emma. Stay away from my children. Callahan smiled. Oh, Lisa. He shook his head. It was never about them. It was about your husband. About the truth he tried to hide. Ben's jaw tightened. He didn't hide anything. Callahan's eyes flicked to him. He ran, didn't he? His voice was sharp. That's what cowards do. Ben's fists clenched. He wasn't going to let Callahan control the story. He took a deep breath and stepped forward. No, he said, his voice steady. He was trying to protect us. For the first time, Callahan's expression shifted. Ben pressed forward. James Holloway. My dad worked for him. And when Holloway disappeared, he knew what really happened, didn't he? Callahan's jaw tightened. But Ben wasn't done. My dad knew you killed him. Silence. A long, heavy silence. Then, Callahan chuckled. It wasn't a laugh. It was dangerous. You're smarter than I thought, he said. Too bad that won't save you. He reached into his coat. Ben saw the gun. Everything slowed. Mom pulled Emma behind her. Ben's heart pounded. Then, a loud voice rang through the house. Drop it, Callahan. Officer Daniels. In the doorway. Gun raised. More officers flooded in behind him. Callahan froze. His face twisted with rage. You little. Daniels stepped forward. Hands. Up. Now. For the first time, Callahan looked trapped. And Ben knew it was over. Callahan had nowhere left to run. The officers moved in. Ben watched as they forced Callahan onto his knees, cuffing his hands behind his back. It was over. Callahan was finally caught. And for the first time in months, Ben felt safe. The days that followed were a blur. Callahan was officially arrested, charged with everything from fraud to conspiracy to murder. More evidence surfaced, documents proving that Callahan had been involved in Holloway's disappearance. Ben's dad had tried to warn someone, but when he realized no one would believe him, he ran. Now, the truth was out. Ben's mom was completely cleared of any wrongdoing. And best of all, they were free. No more running. No more hiding. Their family was whole again. The morning after Callahan's arrest, Ben stood outside, watching the sunrise. The air felt lighter. The world felt new. Behind him, the front door creaked open. Mom stepped out, her hand on his shoulder. You okay? Ben nodded. Yeah. She smiled, wrapping an arm around him. You saved us, you know. Ben swallowed. I just wanted to make things right. Mom brushed his hair back. Your dad would be proud. Ben looked at the photo in his hands. His dad, standing beside James Holloway. He knew his dad had made mistakes. But in the end, he had tried. And now, Ben had finished what he started. Mom took a deep breath. You know what I think? Ben turned to her. What? She smiled. I think this is the start of something new. Ben let those words settle. For the first time in a long time, he actually believed it. He turned to the sky. The sun rose higher, golden light stretching across the horizon. And with it, a new beginning. For all of them.